I bought an old Tesla at an auction for $100, but when the mechanic opened the trunk, he called me. "Ma'am, come urgently." Inside was a sealed briefcase with a lock. When I opened it, I couldn't believe what I saw. Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought a $100 car would change my life. But then again, I never thought a lot of things that ended up being true. My name is Sarah Mitchell. At 38, I was living in a beige rental house on the east side of Phoenix, splitting my weeks between spreadsheets and school pickups. I did freelance bookkeeping for small businesses, restaurants, landscaping companies, a couple of nail salons, and I was good at it, reliable, precise. My ex-husband, Dave, used to say I was too precise, that I couldn't let anything go. He said it like it was a flaw. He left anyway 2 years before for a woman who worked at his gym and apparently had a much more relaxed relationship with details. I kept the apartment, the furniture, and our daughter Kaylee, who was 15 and already taller than me, already more confident than I'd ever been at her age. We were fine. Not thriving, but fine. Money was tighter than I let on to anyone. The kind of tight where you do mental math at the grocery store and put things back quietly. Kaylee needed new tires on her bicycle, and I needed a second car. Something reliable enough for her to eventually learn to drive in, something I could use on days when my old Civic was in the shop, which was happening more and more often. I wasn't looking for anything fancy. I was looking for something cheap and fixable. That's how I ended up at a salvage auction in Tempe on a Thursday morning in early March. The lot was crowded with dealers and mechanics, men in steel-toed boots who walked around vehicles with flashlights and spoke in shorthand I only half understood. I'd done my research online, watched YouTube videos about salvage titles, about what to look for. I wore jeans and my most serious expression and tried not to look like what I was, which was a woman completely out of her depth. The Tesla was sitting at the back of the lot like it didn't belong there. A Model S, silver, 2019. The front end had some damage from what looked like a fender bender. Nothing catastrophic, the kind of thing that looks worse than it is. The rest of it was intact. Clean interior, no water damage. The reason it was on the lot, according to the paperwork, was insurance write-off after a minor collision. The listed previous owner was a holding company with a long, forgettable name. The bidding opened at $50. I raised my paddle twice. Nobody else seemed interested. The damage estimate from the body shop had probably scared people off, but I'd gotten a quote the week before from a mechanic named Tony Reeves, who worked out of a small garage on McDowell Road and whom I'd trusted for years. He'd looked at the photos I sent and said, "Sarah, if you can get that thing for under $500, call me immediately." I got it for $100. I drove it home on a temporary plate carefully with the hazard lights on and dropped it at Tony's garage the next morning. He promised to have a full inspection done within 48 hours. I went home, made coffee, opened my laptop, and returned to the spreadsheet for a restaurant in Scottsdale that needed its quarterly taxes filed by Friday. 2 days later, my phone rang. Tony. I answered expecting a list of repair costs. That's what I was braced for. The part where the good news became complicated. Instead, there was a pause, long enough that I pulled the phone from my ear to check if the call had dropped. "Sarah?" His voice was different, lower, quieter, like he didn't want to be overheard. "I need you to come down here." "Is something wrong with the car? Just tell me over the—" "No, the car's actually in great shape. Listen." Another pause. I open the back, the trunk, and there's a, "You need to come see this yourself. Can you come now?" I remember sitting very still for a moment. The cursor on my spreadsheet blinked. Outside, a neighborhood dog was barking at something. "Tony, what's in the trunk?" "Ma'am, please just come down." He'd never called me ma'am in 10 years. I was in my car within 4 minutes. The drive to McDowell took 12, and I spent every one of them constructing reasonable explanations. Old luggage, a forgotten toolbox, maybe someone's camping equipment left over from a road trip. I told myself the reason Tony sounded strange was that he was being dramatic. Tony was not a dramatic person, but people surprised you sometimes. The garage smelled like motor oil and rubber when I walked in. Tony met me at the door. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with grease permanently worked into the lines of his hands. He looked at me the way doctors look at you when the news isn't good. Steady, careful, choosing his words. "I didn't touch it," he said. "I found the compartment under the trunk liner when I was pulling it up to check for frame damage. There's a false bottom. It's Sarah. It's bolted in. Somebody put it there on purpose." He led me to the back of the car. The trunk liner was pulled aside, and there, fitted precisely into a recessed cavity in the floor, was a case. Aluminum. The kind I'd seen in movies. Hard shell, foam padded, with a 4-digit combination lock on the front and a handle on top. It was the size of a large briefcase. It had been sealed with a strip of black security tape across the seam. I stared at it. Who leaves something like this in a car they're selling? The answer, I realized with a slow, cold certainty, was someone who didn't know the car was being sold. Tony offered to call the police right then and there. Standing in that garage, looking at that case, part of me wanted to say yes, hand it over, walk away, pretend I'd never bought the car in the first place. That would have been the easy thing. But I'd spent 2 years being careful and sensible and doing what was practical, and where had that gotten me? Tight months and a car with a salvage title, and the quiet, persistent feeling that the world had more going on in it than I was ever allowed to see. "Give me a minute," I told Tony. He stepped outside to give me space. I crouched down and looked at the case without touching it. The security tape was still fully intact. No one had opened it since it was sealed. The combination lock had 4 dials. The case itself was a Pelican, 1510. I knew the brand. I'd seen them used by photographers and film crews. Professional, expensive, made to be watertight and virtually indestructible. I pulled out my phone and took photographs of everything. The compartment, the case, the security tape, the lock. I photographed the VIN plate on the door frame and the auction paperwork I'd brought with me in my bag. I documented every detail the way I would document a discrepancy in someone's accounts, methodically, without drama. Then I called Tony back in. "I'm taking the case," I said. He looked at me carefully. "Sarah, I legally purchased this vehicle. Everything in it is legally mine. I'm not going to abandon my property because it's unexpected." I paused. "I'm also not going to open it here." He nodded slowly. He was a good man. He didn't push. I put the case in the trunk of my Civic and drove home. Kaylee was at school. The house was empty and very quiet. I put the case on the kitchen table and sat across from it for 20 minutes, drinking coffee I didn't taste. I thought about all the things that could be inside. Drugs, a weapon, something illegal, something dangerous, something that would pull me into a situation I had no business being near. But I also thought, what if it's something else? I'd been a bookkeeper for 15 years. I knew how money moved when people didn't want it to be seen. I knew what shell companies looked like on paper, what invoice manipulation smelled like, what it meant when numbers didn't quite add up but were clearly arranged to look like they did. I'd seen small-scale fraud plenty of times in my work. I'd also seen, from a professional distance, what large-scale fraud looked like, the kind that moved millions and required legal infrastructure to hide. The holding company listed as the previous owner of the Tesla was called Harlow Meridian, LLC. I looked it up on the drive home. Richard Harlow was a commercial real estate developer based in Scottsdale. He had a website with professional photographs and a biography that mentioned 3 charity boards and 2 government commissions. He had a LinkedIn profile with 800 connections. He had a news article from 2022 in the Arizona Republic about a mixed-use development project in downtown Phoenix worth $42 million. He was successful, connected, and careful. And somehow his car had ended up at a salvage auction for $100 with a locked case hidden in the floor. I took a butter knife from the kitchen drawer and carefully worked the security tape loose at the corner, not cutting it, just separating it so I could preserve it intact. Then I looked at the combination lock. 4 digits. I tried 0000, then 1234, then the current year, then the year of the car's manufacture. On the 5th try, 1979, which I guessed was a birth year, the lock clicked open. I sat back and breathed. Inside, nestled in the gray foam cutouts, were 3 things. The first was money, banded stacks of $100 bills, the kind that come directly from a bank, each band labeled $10,000. I counted 20 stacks, $200,000 in cash. The second was a USB drive, small, black, unlabeled. The third was a manila envelope sealed. When I opened it with careful hands, I found documents, printed pages, dense, formatted, full of numbers and names and dates. I recognized the structure immediately. These were financial records, internal ones, not the kind you'd file publicly, transfer confirmations, account numbers, a series of payments made through a chain of LLCs that looped back, eventually, to a name I didn't recognize yet. Harlow Meridian routed through something called Crestline Capital Group and something else called Pacific Shore Holdings. At the very back of the envelope, there was a single handwritten note on a yellow sticky pad. 4 words, in small, cramped handwriting. He's going to run. I sat at my kitchen table with $200,000 and evidence of what looked like significant financial fraud, and I tried to think clearly. Here was the situation as I understood it. Richard Harlow, or someone connected to him, had hidden this case in his car. The car had gone to auction, almost certainly by mistake. Whoever sealed this case had expected to retrieve it, and they hadn't retrieved it, which meant they didn't know yet where it was. But they would figure it out. People like this always figured it out. How long did I have before someone came looking? I repacked everything exactly as I'd found it, relatched the case, and carried it to my bedroom closet, where I put it behind my winter coats and a box of Kaylee's old school projects. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about what I was going to do. Running away from it wasn't an option. Returning it quietly wasn't an option either. If I handed evidence of fraud back to the person committing it, I became complicit. Calling the police without understanding what I had was dangerous too. I could hand something over and have it disappear, or worse, find myself caught in the middle of something political. No. I needed to understand exactly what I had before I did anything. I needed a lawyer, a specific kind of lawyer, and I needed someone else to see that USB drive. By the time Kaylee came home from school and asked what was for dinner, I already had the beginning of a plan. The next morning, I dropped Kaylee at school and drove directly to the office of a woman named Patricia Okafor. I'd found her through a contact, a restaurant owner I did books for, who'd once mentioned that his sister had used Okafor in a whistleblower case involving a regional bank. Okafor had a small office in a building near downtown Phoenix. No fancy reception area, just a waiting room with 2 chairs and a framed print of the Arizona desert on the wall. She was in her mid-50s, Nigerian-American, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the kind of calm that felt earned rather than performed. I told her everything. I brought the photographs I'd taken on my phone. I did not bring the case. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You haven't touched the cash?" she asked. "No." "You haven't spent any of it, moved it, or shown it to anyone other than your mechanic?" "Correct." She nodded slowly. "Okay, here's where you stand legally. You purchased the vehicle at a legitimate public auction. Everything found inside constitutes abandoned property under Arizona law, which means you have a valid legal claim to it. However," she held up one finger, "if those documents contain evidence of a federal crime, which from what you're describing is likely, then depending on how this plays out, those funds could be subject to asset forfeiture. You don't want to spend that money, not a dollar." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." She folded her hands on the desk. "I want to look at that USB drive before anything else. Do you have a trusted contact in IT forensics?" I did, actually. A woman named Renata Sousa, who did cybersecurity consulting and whom I'd met through a small business owners network 2 years before. Renata was thorough, discreet, and very good at her job. Patricia and I agreed on a plan. I would bring the physical documents and the drive to Renata's office that afternoon. Patricia would begin a preliminary review. No one would contact any authorities until we understood exactly what we were dealing with. I left Patricia's office and sat in my car in the parking lot for a moment. The sun was already hot at 9 in the morning. Downtown Phoenix glittered in the distance. Somewhere out there, Richard Harlow was probably sitting in a beautiful office, and he probably didn't know yet. But the clock was ticking. Renata worked out of a converted space in a tech co-working building in Tempe. She had a setup that looked like mission control. 3 monitors, external drives stacked on shelves, cables running everywhere. She plugged in the USB drive using an isolated laptop that wasn't connected to any network, which she explained was standard protocol when you didn't know what you were working with. It took her 4 hours. When she came out of her concentration and turned to face me, she looked the way people look when they've seen something they can't unsee. "Sarah," she said, "this isn't small." The drive contained encrypted files, but whoever had encrypted them had used a commercial program, and the password was embedded in the metadata in a way that Renata said was a beginner's mistake. Once decrypted, the files revealed a systematic record of what appeared to be a multi-year fraud scheme involving construction contracts. Harlow's company had overbilled on municipal projects, city contracts for public buildings, a community center, a parking structure, by inflating subcontractor costs through shell companies that Harlow himself controlled. The difference between what was billed to the city and what was actually paid to real subcontractors had been routed in increments through the chain of LLCs I'd seen in the paper documents and eventually withdrawn as cash. The cash in the case. The total amount, based on what Renata calculated from the records, was approximately $2.3 million over 4 years. And the note, "He's going to run," suggested that whoever had written it knew Harlow was planning to disappear with the money, which meant there was someone on the inside, someone who had hidden this case not to protect Harlow, but as insurance against him. "Whoever put this together," Renata said quietly, "was documenting the scheme from the inside. This is a paper trail built by someone who was part of it. A whistleblower who'd gotten cold feet, or someone who'd been betrayed and was preparing leverage. Either way, those documents were a complete, organized record of Richard Harlow's fraud against the city of Phoenix. I photographed everything Renata showed me. I made 2 encrypted copies of the drive. I took the originals back to my house, put them in the case, and moved the case to a storage unit I rented that afternoon in a facility 8 miles from my home, under my name, paid in cash from my own account. That evening, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. There was no message. 10 minutes later, I got a text from the same number. It said, "The Tesla you purchased. I believe there may be some personal items of mine still in the vehicle. Would you be available to discuss?" No name, just the message. I stared at it for a long time. He knew, or someone who worked for him knew. They'd tracked the auction record, found the buyer, and found me. My hands were very steady when I took a screenshot of the text and forwarded it to Patricia. Her response came within 3 minutes. "Do not reply. This is actually good for us. Save everything." I saved everything. And I realized, sitting in my quiet beige kitchen with my daughter doing homework at the table 10 feet away, that the point of no return had already passed. Not when I'd opened the case. Not when I'd driven to Patricia's office. It had passed the moment a mechanic named Tony had called me and said, "Ma'am, please just come down." Everything after that was just deciding what kind of person I was going to be. Patricia and I met the following Monday with an agent from the FBI's Phoenix field office. This had been Patricia's recommendation. Municipal fraud of this scale, involving city contracts, would fall under federal jurisdiction. And going directly to federal authorities, rather than local police, who might have political entanglements with a developer of Harlow's profile, was both safer and more strategically sound. The agent's name was Marcus Webb. He was younger than I expected, early 40s, with a precise manner and the habit of writing everything down in a small spiral notebook rather than on a phone or tablet. He listened to everything without expression. He looked at the copies of the documents. He asked careful questions. At the end of 2 hours, he told us that the FBI had actually received a separate complaint about Harlow Meridian LLC 18 months earlier, a complaint that had gone nowhere because there was insufficient evidence. What I had, he said quietly, changed that. I was formally designated as a material witness and a cooperating party. Patricia negotiated the terms. The cash in the case would be held as evidence, with my legal claim to it documented and preserved, pending the outcome of any prosecution. I was not required to surrender the original documents immediately. Patricia insisted on copies going to the FBI first, with originals held securely until a formal evidence protocol was in place. Agent Webb agreed. We walked out of that building into bright afternoon sunlight, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, exactly, more like momentum. The threat came 4 days later. I was in my driveway loading grocery bags from the car when a black SUV pulled up to the curb. A woman got out. She was in her early 40s, tall, with dark hair pulled back in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent. She walked up my driveway with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. I recognized the name from the documents. Harlow's attorney, his business associate, and, according to what Renata had found in several internal emails on the USB drive, his romantic partner, Diana Crane. She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "I'm Diana Crane. I'm an attorney representing Harlow Meridian LLC. I wonder if we could talk." "About what?" I asked. I kept my voice flat and my expression neutral. "About a vehicle you recently purchased and some items that were inadvertently left in it." She tilted her head. "We're prepared to compensate you generously for your time and for the return of those items. Very generously." I'm not sure what items you're referring to, I said. Her smile stayed fixed. I think you do. And I think you're smart enough to understand that the situation you're currently in has some significant risks attached to it. Legal risks, for you specifically. She let that sit for a moment. Whatever you think you found in that car, you should consider carefully who you're dealing with before you make any decisions that can't be undone. There it was, the velvet glove over the iron fist. I looked at her steadily. You're welcome to have your attorney contact mine, I said. Patricia Okafor. I'll get you her card. Something moved in Diana Crane's eyes. The name had landed. I went inside, closed the door, and locked it. I was shaking slightly, but it was adrenaline, not fear. Or maybe it was both, and I was choosing not to tell the difference. I called Patricia immediately. She told me to write down everything Diana had said, with timestamps, and send it to her and to Agent Webb. It was recorded as an intimidation attempt. 2 days later, a different pressure. A voicemail from a number registered to Harlow's main office, left while I was at a client meeting. A man's voice, smooth, measured, the voice of someone accustomed to boardrooms and fundraising dinners. Richard Harlow himself. Ms. Mitchell, I understand there may have been some confusion. I'd really appreciate the chance to sit down with you and clear this up personally. I think once you understand the full context, you'll see that what you've stumbled into isn't what it appears to be. I'm a fair man. I'd like the opportunity to demonstrate that I forwarded the voicemail to Patricia and Webb without listening to it a second time. 3 days after that, there was a man sitting in a parked car across the street from Kaylee's school when I picked her up. He drove away when he saw me see him. I photographed his license plate. It traced back to a security consulting firm that, according to Renata, had done work for Harlow's company in the past. They were watching me. Watching my daughter. I reported it. Webb sent a contact to speak with the school's administration. Additional security measures were put in place, and Webb told me with a directness I appreciated, Ms. Mitchell, they are scared. Scared people make mistakes. Keep documenting everything. That night, after Kaylee was asleep, I sat on my back porch in the warm Arizona dark. The cactus in my neighbor's yard was just visible in the moonlight. I thought about the woman who'd shown up in my driveway with her expensive suit and her careful threats, and the man on the voicemail with his smooth, patient voice. They had more money than I would ever see. They had connections and attorneys and a security firm on retainer. And I had $100 car, a storage unit full of their secrets, and an FBI agent with a spiral notebook. I decided quietly and completely that I was not afraid. I took a week, not a full week, but several days, to be deliberately still. I cooked dinners. I took Kaylee to see a movie on a Wednesday night. I went for long walks in the early morning before the Phoenix heat set in. I let Patricia and Agent Webb do their work. I did not check my email compulsively. I did not drive past the storage unit to reassure myself. I recharged. Because what was coming next would require everything I had. The offer arrived on a Tuesday via certified mail, sent to Patricia's office. It was written on Harlow Meridian LLC letterhead, drafted by Diana Crane in her capacity as legal counsel, and it was, on its surface, extraordinarily generous. Richard Harlow was offering to settle any and all claims arising from the vehicle auction in the amount of $350,000, paid directly to me in a lump sum within 10 business days of signed agreement. The conditions: I would return all items found in the vehicle, provide a signed affidavit confirming I had retained no copies of any documents or digital files, agree to a permanent non-disclosure agreement, and confirm that I had not shared any information with third parties. Patricia called me after she'd read it. I could hear the careful neutrality in her voice that meant she was about to tell me something I needed to hear clearly. "It's a significant sum," she said. "I know. And if their legal team is worth anything, which it is, they know that this offer is also their last attempt to contain this before it becomes uncontainable. $350,000 is not generosity, Sarah. It's a calculation. They think that's the number that makes you disappear." I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. The morning light was coming through the window at an angle that made the whole room look golden and still. "What happens if I sign?" I asked, not because I was considering it, because I wanted to hear it said out loud. The FBI investigation loses its primary cooperating witness and most of its documentary evidence. The case likely folds. Harlow walks away. The city of Phoenix never recovers $2.3 million that was stolen from its residents. And you sign a legally binding document that would expose you to significant civil liability if you ever spoke about any of this again. I let the silence sit for a moment. "Draft a response declining the offer," I said, politely but completely. Patricia's exhale was quiet and warm, already started. The strange thing about that period was how calm I felt. I'd expected fear to be the dominant note, and there had been fear in the days right after Diana Crane showed up in my driveway. But somewhere in the week I'd given myself to breathe. Something had settled. I had done everything correctly. I had legal representation. I had federal backing. I had documentation, copies, a paper trail of my own that matched every step I'd taken since Tony had called me from that garage. There was nothing to be done except wait and be steady. I found steadiness in unexpected places. Renata, who had become something of an unlikely ally, started checking in regularly. Not about the case, just to talk. She'd bring coffee to my porch on Saturday mornings, and we'd sit and watch the neighborhood go by. She was direct and practical and had a way of saying things that cut through noise. "You know what this actually is?" she said one Saturday, holding her paper cup in both hands. "It's an accounting problem. You have the receipts. They don't." I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. I also called my sister, Donna, who lived in Tucson and who I hadn't been fully honest with since this started. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which for Donna was practically miraculous. When I finished, she said, "Sarah, you are the most careful person I have ever met in my entire life, and that is the only reason this is going to work out." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a battle cry, but it was exactly what I needed. Kaylee didn't know the details. She knew something stressful was happening. Teenagers always know, but she also knew I was handling it. She'd become quietly protective in small ways. She started doing the dishes without being asked. She started texting me after school to confirm she'd arrived home. One evening, she sat down next to me on the couch and leaned her head against my shoulder without saying a word. We watched television for an hour in comfortable silence. I thought about what kind of woman I wanted her to see me be. From across town, I knew Harlow and Diana were watching, waiting for me to crack, waiting for doubt to set in, for the money to seem more attractive than the fight, for isolation to wear me down. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't isolated. I had a lawyer, a forensic tech specialist, an FBI agent, a sister, a mechanic who'd started my whole situation, and a 15-year-old who leaned on me in the evenings. That wasn't nothing. That was everything. They came on a Sunday afternoon, both of them this time. I was in the backyard pulling weeds from around the base of the saguaro I'd been trying to keep alive for 3 years when I heard the knock at the front door. Kaylee was at a friend's house. The timing felt deliberate, as if they'd waited until I was alone. Richard Harlow was shorter than I'd imagined from his photographs. Late 50s, silver-haired, wearing a linen shirt and slacks that suggested a weekend, not a business meeting. He had the kind of tan that comes from years of outdoor charity golf tournaments. His smile was practiced and warm, the smile of a man who'd spent decades making people feel like he was their friend. Diana stood slightly behind him. She was dressed more casually than the last time, jeans, a blazer, and she had arranged her expression into something that approximated openness. "Ms. Mitchell," Harlow said, "I really hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I wanted to speak with you personally. I thought maybe if we could just talk, person to person, we could move past all this unpleasantness." I looked at both of them for a moment. Then I stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," I said. I made no offer of coffee or water. I sat across from them at the kitchen table and I waited. Harlow leaned forward with his hands folded, his expression earnest. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah?" He didn't wait for my answer. "I want to be completely honest with you. There are documents in that case that, taken out of context, look bad. I understand that. But the full picture is more complicated than you know." "How so?" I said. "Business is messy, especially at the scale we operate at. There are internal transfers, accounting strategies, structure decisions that are legal, but that look unusual to someone who doesn't have the full background." He paused meaningfully. "What you found is the result of some aggressive but entirely lawful tax planning. The people who would try to use those documents against me, and there are people who want to use them, Sarah, business rivals, people with their own agendas. They would devastate your reputation right alongside mine if this went further." Devastate your reputation. There it was. Diana spoke now, softer than before. "We're genuinely worried about you. What you're doing, cooperating with federal investigators without fully understanding what you're cooperating against, puts you in a very exposed position, legally, personally." Her eyes were steady and concerned. Performed concern, but well performed. We've seen this happen before. People who get caught in the middle of things they don't fully understand and end up facing consequences they never anticipated. I let her finish. Then I said, "Is that a threat?" Harlow's smile stayed in place. "Of course not. We're trying to protect you." "You're trying to protect yourselves," I said. My voice was level. "And I appreciate the performance, I really do, but I want to be straightforward with you. The documents you're describing as aggressive tax planning have been reviewed by people with more expertise than either of us, and the characterization doesn't hold up. You know that, which is why you're here." The warmth in Harlow's expression shifted. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for that, but the edges of it hardened slightly. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Quiet now. No more performance." "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to make." Diana placed both hands flat on the table and leaned forward. "Sarah, walk away from this. Take the offer. $350,000. You could buy this house outright. You could pay for your daughter's college. You could stop doing bookkeeping for nail salons and actually build a life." Her voice was very measured, very clear. "This is the last time we're going to make this offer." I looked at her. I thought about Kaylee's college. I thought about the beige walls of my rental and the tight months at the grocery store and the Civic that needed new rotors. And then I thought about $2.3 million stolen from the city of Phoenix, from schools and roads and public buildings, from people exactly like me who'd never know it was gone. "I think you should leave now," I said. Harlow stood slowly. His face had gone flat, the friendliness completely drained from it, And what was underneath wasn't rage. It was something colder. The look of a man who had operated without consequence for a long time and was only now beginning to understand that this might be the end of that. "You have no idea what you're inviting," he said. "Get out of my house," I said. Diana's heels were sharp on my kitchen floor as they walked out. The front door clicked shut behind them. I sat at the table for a long moment, not moving. Then I reached out and pressed record on my phone, which I had placed in my kitchen fruit bowl before I'd let them in. Both audio and video angled upward. Everything they'd said, every word. I sent the file to Patricia and Agent Webb within the hour. The fear came later, in the evening, when the house was dark and quiet. It was real fear, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone. These were powerful people who had just told me, in the politest possible terms, that they would come at me hard. But here's what I discovered about fear, sitting alone in my kitchen that night. Sometimes it doesn't weaken you. Sometimes it clarifies things. It strips away all the noise and leaves just the essential question. What kind of woman do I want to be? I already knew the answer. I went to bed at 10 o'clock and I slept soundly. The federal grand jury convened 8 weeks after my first meeting with Agent Webb. I did not attend those proceedings. Cooperating witnesses rarely do, and Patricia had advised me to stay away from the courthouse entirely during that phase. But Webb kept me informed through Patricia, and what was emerging from the investigation was considerably larger than anything I'd imagined when I'd first sat at my kitchen table with a locked aluminum case in front of me. The internal emails on the USB drive, the ones Renata had decrypted, contained conversations between Harlow and Diana that laid out the scheme in devastating detail. More than that, the drive had been compiled and stored by someone inside their organization. Agent Webb eventually identified this person as Harlow's former CFO, a man named Gregory Stahl, who had been pushed out of the company 18 months earlier after a dispute about profit distributions. Stahl had built the file as leverage and hidden it in the car, Harlow's personal vehicle, the day before the accident that sent it to the auction lot. The accident itself had been staged by Harlow's team to accelerate an insurance payout, and the car had gone to auction because Harlow's assistant had made a clerical error, listed the wrong vehicle for disposal, a $100 administrative mistake. The full scope of the fraud as the investigation widened touched not just city contracts in Phoenix, but 2 neighboring municipalities, and involved bribes paid to 2 city officials, one of whom had already entered a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. I learned all of this gradually, in pieces, through Patricia, and I went on with my life, taking Kaylee to school, filing tax returns for my clients, going to Renata's on Saturday mornings. Then came the morning of the hearing. It was a preliminary evidentiary hearing in federal court, and I was called to testify about the chain of custody of the documents, how I'd found them, what I'd done with them, who I'd contacted, and when. It was not a dramatic courtroom scene. It was procedural, careful, and very precise. I wore a gray blazer and my most serious shoes. Patricia sat beside me. I answered every question directly and fully, without elaboration. Harlow and Diana were present, seated at the defense table. I hadn't been in the same room with Harlow since the Sunday afternoon in my kitchen. He looked diminished in a way I hadn't expected. Thinner. The tan had faded. His attorney, an expensive one, from a large firm in Washington, sat beside him and placed a hand occasionally on his arm, the way you'd restrain someone who might move unpredictably. When the prosecution played a portion of the audio recording from my kitchen, Diana's voice, clear and controlled, offering me money to disappear, something happened at the defense table. Harlow's attorney leaned over and said something sharply, and Harlow's face went very still. Diana, beside him, looked down at her hands. Then the prosecution introduced the timestamp data from the USB drive's internal file logs. The files had been compiled and last modified on a specific date, a date that, according to Harlow's own calendar records, he had met with Gregory Stahl for what he'd claimed was a routine budget review. A meeting he'd claimed was about operations, not fraud. Harlow's attorney objected. The judge overruled. The attorney objected again on a different basis. Overruled again. And then, in the way that these things happen, not with an explosion but with a quiet mechanical click, Harlow turned to his attorney and said something in a voice low enough that I couldn't hear it. His attorney went still. Diana looked at Harlow sharply. There was a short, quiet argument between the two of them at the defense table, in whispers, while the courtroom waited. The attorney leaned over to the prosecution table and exchanged a brief, quiet word. A recess was called. Patricia leaned over to me and said very quietly, "His attorney just opened the door to a cooperation discussion." I looked at the empty bench where the judge had been sitting. Through the tall windows, Phoenix was bright and ordinary outside. "He's going to turn on her?" I asked. "Or she's going to turn on him," Patricia said. "Or both. That's usually how this ends." I thought about the handwritten note in the manila envelope. "He's going to run." Whoever had written that note, Gregory Stahl, sitting somewhere under federal protection, his own deal already made, had known exactly what kind of man Richard Harlow was. When the hearing reconvened 35 minutes later, Harlow's attorney made a formal statement indicating that his client wished to explore cooperation with federal prosecutors. Diana Crane, 3 feet away, did not look at him. Her own attorney, who had arrived during the recess, was already filing a separate motion. I sat very still and watched the two of them come apart at the seams, and I felt nothing so much as a profound and quiet vindication. The plea agreements took 4 months to finalize. Richard Harlow pled guilty to federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud against the government, and 2 counts of bribery. In exchange for his cooperation against Diana and against the 2 city officials involved, he received a reduced sentence of 7 years in federal prison. He was ordered to repay a total of $4.1 million, a figure that had grown as the investigation widened, and to relinquish all assets held by Harlow Meridian, LLC. His development projects were suspended. The company was dissolved. The office in Scottsdale, with its professional photographs and its view of the mountains, was vacated, the lease terminated, the furniture sold at commercial liquidation. The charity boards removed his name from their donor walls. The government commission he had sat on quietly scrubbed his biography from their website. A man who had spent 2 decades building a public identity as a pillar of the Phoenix business community watched it all come down in the space of a single news cycle. Diana Crane pled guilty to 1 count of obstruction of justice and 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud. She received 3 years in federal prison and disbarment. She would never practice law again. The State Bar of Arizona published the formal notice of her disbarment as required by law, and it was available to anyone who searched her name. She'd spent 20 years building a legal career. It was gone in an afternoon with a signature on a plea agreement and the quiet closing of a courtroom door. The 2 city officials entered cooperation agreements and received lesser sentences. The city of Phoenix began the process of recovering the overbilled funds and the municipal projects that Harlow had inflated. The community center, the parking structure, were audited in full. City council members made statements. There were news stories. The names of the overbilled contracts became part of the public record. Gregory Stahl, the former CFO who had compiled and hidden the case, received prosecutorial immunity in exchange for his full cooperation. He had, by hiding those documents in that car, accidentally set in motion the unraveling of everything. I never met him. I thought about writing to him once, then decided against it. What would I have said? Thank you for being betrayed? Some things don't translate neatly into words. Nobody gave much thought to how the car had ended up at the auction, but I thought about it. I thought about the particular chain of small accidents and oversights and acts of desperation that had placed a $100 Tesla in front of me on a Thursday morning in Tempe. One man's administrative error, one former employee's hidden evidence, one minor fender bender. The whole elaborate structure of Richard Harlow's fraud, which had survived audits and municipal reviews and 18 months of an earlier federal inquiry, brought down not by a sophisticated investigation, but by a clerical mistake and a woman who couldn't afford not to pay attention. And me, a woman with a clipboard and a paddle, standing at the back of a crowded lot looking for something practical. There was one more thing. In the final asset settlement, Patricia argued, successfully, that my legal claim to the contents of the vehicle I had purchased at a legitimate public auction should be recognized. The $200,000 in cash, which had been held as evidence, was subject to a civil forfeiture proceeding. Most of it was absorbed into the Federal Asset Recovery Fund, but a portion, $62,000, was awarded to me as a documented finder's fee and compensation for my cooperation as a material witness, minus the legal costs that Patricia helped me negotiate down significantly. It was not $200,000. It was not $350,000. But it was real, and it was mine, and I had earned it without signing a single document that required me to disappear. I called Tony Reeves and told him the broad strokes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I always said, Sarah, that car was a good deal." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. I bought the house. Not the beige rental on the east side, a different house in a neighborhood with old trees and a community garden 2 blocks away. 3 bedrooms, a yard with actual grass, and a porch where I put 2 chairs, one for me and one for whenever Renata came on Saturdays, which she still did. Kaylee got the larger bedroom. She hung string lights and painted one wall a shade of green that I would not have chosen, but that looked, I admitted privately, exactly right. She was 16 by the time we moved in, and she had started taking a photography class at school and had decided she wanted to study environmental science. I didn't know yet if that would stick, but I liked the direction of it. The instinct toward paying attention to things, to understanding how systems worked and what happened when they broke down. She was becoming, I realized quietly, someone who asked questions and waited for real answers. I recognized that impulse. I had learned it myself the hard way. She didn't know everything, but she knew I had done something difficult and important and that it had worked out. That was enough. Some lessons don't need to be explained. They just need to be witnessed. My freelance practice grew. It had been growing for a while, actually. 2 of my clients had referred me to others during the period when I'd been dealing with the case, because my work hadn't slipped during any of it. I'd kept every deadline, returned every call. By the following spring, I had more business than I could handle alone, and I hired a part-time assistant, a recent accounting graduate named Marcus, who turned out to be meticulous and very fast. I was running a small practice. I bought new software. I raised my rates. The Tesla was repaired at Tony's garage. The front end, a new bumper, some sensor recalibration, and I drove it for 2 more years before selling it at a price that returned me every dollar of the repair cost, plus a fair profit. It drove beautifully. Of course it did. Richard Harlow was released from federal prison after serving 5.5 years with good behavior. I know because Patricia sent me a brief note when it happened, a courtesy update, nothing more. He had no company to return to, no assets, no professional standing. There were news articles about his release. The comments were unkind. He moved, according to what little information circulated, to a small town in rural Nevada to live near a brother. There were no more fundraising dinners, no more charity golf tournaments, no more profiles in business publications. The man who had once sat on 3 charity boards and 2 government commissions now lived quietly and anonymously, entirely forgotten by the city he had spent years cultivating. Phoenix had moved on without him. It hadn't needed long. Diana Crane served 2 years and was released. She could not practice law. She had, from what I understood, used most of her savings on legal fees. She moved out of Arizona. I don't know where. I didn't look for her. I had no reason to. The woman who had walked up my driveway in an expensive suit and told me in the politest possible terms that I had no idea what I was inviting. She'd been right, in a way. I hadn't known exactly what I was inviting, but it had turned out to be justice, which is not always poetic, but is always worth the cost. I thought about them occasionally, not often, not with satisfaction exactly, more with the recognition that consequences are real and that powerful people sometimes forget that until they're reminded. Gregory Stahl, the former CFO who had started all of this by hiding a case in a car trunk, used his immunity agreement to pivot into forensic accounting consulting. He apparently had quite a lot of expertise. I found this neither surprising nor ironic. People contain multitudes. Renata and I had coffee on my new porch on a Saturday morning about a year after everything concluded. The saguaro I'd been trying to keep alive for 3 years had come with me from the rental. I'd had it dug up and replanted, a slightly absurd expense that Tony had helped me execute, and it stood in the corner of the yard, taller now, as unbothered as ever. "Do you think about it?" Renata asked. "The case, any of it?" "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly I think about Tony's phone call, how I almost didn't go." "You always would have gone." "You think?" She considered this. "You're too precise to let something go unresolved." I thought about Dave saying it like it was a flaw. "Maybe," I said. The neighborhood was waking up around us. A dog was being walked. Someone's sprinklers came on. The desert light was turning from gold to white, the way it did by 9 o'clock. I was exactly where I had chosen to be. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have taken the money and walked away, or would you have stayed and fought? If this story made you think, leave a comment below. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.